And welcome back to another Roundtable. This week, we are showcasing our Contemporary Thought and Politics department, and we have a few of our key research members on our team here with us today to talk to you about the work that they do and really what inspired them to bring them to where they are today. So without further ado, inshallah, we'll go ahead and get started with Dr. Zara Khan, who is currently the director of our department. So I'd like to pass it along to Dr. Zara, if we could hear a little bit more about your department overall, and of course, an introduction as to how you got here, how you got involved with Yaqeen, and what your department looks like.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Tasneem. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Zara Khan, and I think my journey to Yaqeen began a few years ago. I was made aware of the material that Yaqeen was producing in various areas and was asked to peer review some articles. Mashallah, Dr. Khalifa and Sheikh Umar Suleiman's, Dr. Nima Abdi's paper, actually. And it was such a pleasure to read this intellectually robust research project from within an Islamic worldview and from within the lens of trying to help dispel the doubts of American Muslims. I really felt at home right away in that type of work. And before that, I had just been doing, several different projects in education, in academia, in and out of academia, in Muslim spaces, as well as in the Liberal Academy. Not so much in research, strictly speaking, but more in teaching. And the subjects that really have drawn my attention have been the humanities and English literature, poetry, as well as political science, comparative political theory, questions of social justice generally. And so my mind, I think, was already in that state of mind, ready to kind of explore and see what a Muslim think tank, which is dually committed to an academic excellence in research and also to a faith-based imperative to help American Muslims tackle the doubts that we all experience in our faith. So I was kind of ready and happy to join a project like that. As for my own familiarity with those doubts, I think it's very important, mashallah, a lot of the folks in this department specifically, we have passions and subject area knowledge in social aspects, economic and political aspects, things that you can say are kind of on the ground for people, aspects of daily life. And so thinking through some of those issues that I had been doing for several years, I was able to bring that lens to the work that I'm able to do at Yaqeen.
And can you share with us just a personal story of what brought you here? Everyone who's following us on social media has had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, about your experiences with diversity in New York City, and some of the advice you've had to impart. If there's anything else you'd like to share with us.
For sure, yeah, Jazakallah khair. I think being from New York City, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, and I always had a passion for understanding social issues and looking at questions of social justice, from my parents' example and just from the fact of coming up in a very diverse city, faith-based as well as culturally, racially diverse city, economically diverse. But I think that September 11th had a very direct impact on projecting me more into that direction in a very vocational way, I would say, because as a muhajjaba, taking the train to school and just coming up in the city, I had to experience what a lot of Muslims at the time were going through, and some of the fear in the city of Islam, of Muslims, and some of the ignorance that kind of floated to the surface. And so, for example, visiting detainees, over the bridge in New Jersey, and speaking to them about them being detained for being Muslims after 9/11. But trying to draw the parallels between the fact that their cellmates are African Americans and Latino Americans who have been detained for other reasons, understanding that we're part of the same system and affected by much of the same vicissitudes, albeit in different ways because of, exactly who we are and what our social locations are. So I would say that would be an impactful point in the trajectory that brought me here.
Awesome, alhamdulillah. We're happy to have you on the team and leading it as well, inshallah. I'd like to pass it now to Dr. Muhammad Khalifa. You're now currently in Ohio or Minnesota. Where are you at? And please just give us an overview of your background and what brought you here.
Absolutely. I'm in Ohio at the Ohio State University. I was at the University of Minnesota for like 5 years. So, and it was a recent move. We came here last summer. I was recruited to run a new center that they're upstarting. Actually, we've been working on it this year, but it should be rolling out this fall, which is a center for urban and rural education that will focus on equity and inclusion in schools. My research line deals with leadership in educational organizations. It also deals with policy. I started out as a classroom teacher in Detroit. I'm from Michigan. A number of us have Michigan connections, so that's nice. But I started out as a classroom teacher, teaching, middle school, teaching science. Both of my parents were educators. My grandparents were all plant workers who came up. Well, my grandfathers were, but they were all sharecroppers in the beginning, and they came up. And my parents are the ones that accepted Islam, and they went into education. And it was a connection there because my father was the principal of the first Claire Muhammad school. Anyway, getting back to the story, I went into this because, and I guess it's an appropriate time to share my story now. I went into this because I couldn't answer all of the questions that I was interested in just by being in the classroom. There were a number of confusing things, and so this kind of led me to want to study leadership and policy because, for example, I remember it being a primarily Black. At the first school I taught at, actually, the leadership team was primarily African American, as I was. Most of the students were also minoritized, either African American or immigrant of some sort. And I remember the suspension list one day in particular coming in, and it was like 400 students on the suspension list. And what that meant is that they were being denied an education, because everyone knew that when you did not want the kids, when you didn't feel like dealing with the kids, then you would just, find a way to get them onto the suspension list, right? And so then everybody knew that, folks would be at work and they couldn't bring their kids. So that would be a few extra days that we didn't have to deal with these particular students. So this very insidious type of oppression was happening at the hands of, I recognize it as a type of racial oppression, but it was happening at the hands of people of color. And so that led me into wanting to study policy and leadership. And so because of that, I've come to call my work culturally responsive school leadership, which studies ways that school leaders can enact policies and can enact leadership practices that are humanizing towards students of color and other minoritized students as well, even poor white students who are robbed of their humanity in schools. And so I've done this kind of work. I've done research across a number of different states. I've done research in multiple countries and taught courses in the delegations, both in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and even Central Asia. Because of my most recent published book, I started to really, actually, when I got to the University of Minnesota, I started to write toward practitioners. And so this is really taking my work in a new direction. It's blossomed it so that I've been in conversation in the past 5 years with literally hundreds, if not thousands, of school leaders across the country. We do an academy for them. We do something called equity audits, and we just really go deep with practitioners now, even though it's based on research. I'm still an active researcher and publishing all the time, but I'm really just happy to be at a place that, the work is finally having impact. So.
That's incredible. But from what it sounds like you've been having impact far before you joined Yaqeen. So we hope that your experience and the contributions you've made have only multiplied the work that you do in as many beneficial ways as possible. I do have to express my dismay at the fact that you are now at OSU as a Michigander yourself. I'm sure that took a lot of commitment to make. And I think it's a perfect transition because Noor and I actually went to the University of Michigan together and, have shared commitment against OSU. Respect.
Let there be no mistake about it. I'm a Wolverine. I went to Michigan undergrad many moons before you all did. I'm a Wolverine.
Love to hear it. Alhamdulillah. Noor, go ahead, please introduce yourself and share a little bit about here.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Tasneem and Dr. Zara, for putting this together. So as Tasneem said, I went to the University of Michigan and studied international affairs, Arabic and American or ethnic studies there, and then continued to do my master's in Middle East studies, which is really where I began to focus my research on kind of the intersection of Islam and politics and culture. And that's really what I try to focus on through my work at Yaqeen. In terms of how I kind of got into this, I think that there were many factors, but one of them is just the fact of growing up in the U.S., a child of immigrants in a post 9/11 world, as Dr. Zara said, and going through several experiences where I felt like my Muslim identity, what it means to be Muslim, was imposed onto me by others, and I saw that happening with many community members as well, and with our communities as a whole, kind of navigating what it meant to be Muslim in the U.S. post 9/11, and kind of the negotiations and compromises around that, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. And so I focused my master's studies on kind of how U.S. policy in the Middle East has impacted domestic Muslim American communities. And then I went on to work in community organizing and advocacy, specifically around issues of surveillance of Muslim communities in the Dearborn, Detroit area. And then went on to do research in similar topics. And Tasneem had asked us to share a personal story, so I guess I'll do that now. And my personal story is about the first time that I traveled to Palestine, where my family is from. And my family had been expelled from Palestine in 1948 during the Nakba, and since then had moved to Jordan, and then are now between Jordan and the US. And growing up, I had never been to Palestine, didn't really have any physical connections there until I was actually in graduate school, and I was able to visit and visited the villages where my parents' families were from. So when I visited the village of my mother's family, which is now completely abandoned and in ruins, and actually there's a new plan by the government of Israel to create housing units and develop a mall and different kind of attractions for people in Israel to go to there. When I went there, I met a man who had been fighting for decades. He's probably in his mid to late 80s now, and had been expelled from that village when he was 6 or 7, and had been fighting for decades to preserve the history of that village, preserve the history of the communities that lived there. And he immediately, I had no idea who he was, but when I got there and told him that my family was there, he gave me a huge hug, showed me where my grandparents' homes were, and told me all of these stories, took me to the masjid in that village where we were with a group of other Muslims from around the world. One of them made adhan there. And it was really just a beautiful moment that I share now, not only because my family's history in Palestine is one of the reasons that I have pursued this line of work and kind of studying the Middle East, but also because the stories of Muslims around the world who are facing oppression and live in these conditions and constantly resisting and using Islam as a mechanism of resistance is something that really inspires me and drives me to do this work and to learn about the roots of some of that oppression that causes these conditions. So,
Alhamdulillah. I have to share with you all that Noor and I were once upon a time pre-med. So I'm glad that we both had a chance to explore and really learn about what we really wanted to do. And alhamdulillah, now we have Noor contributing in so many amazing ways. Dr. Navid, if we can go ahead and just get your introduction before we dive into the topic a bit. What brought you to Yaqeen and some of your experiences as well, inshallah.
Sure. So Jazakallah khair to Yaqeen for organizing this roundtable. Really excited and honored to be a part of it. And to my participants in this roundtable, really it's an honor to be on a platform with you all. So my name is Navid. I'm like Dr. Khalifa. I'm in kind of the realm of educational studies. So, and similar to other people that are also on this panel or on this roundtable, I will, inshallah, be having close ties to the Michigan area in the near future. So, inshallah, I'll be starting a position in anti-racism education at the University of Windsor. So, in terms of, I guess, how I got to this point, when I look at my sort of life, my educational career or my educational background, when I first started as an undergrad to where I ended up here, like Noor and Tasneem and many other Muslims, I think, that grew up in the same sort of time frame, we kind of had a reawakening, and it totally changed our direction trajectory. So I started my undergraduate career as a student in accounting. I was doing a BCom in accounting, and I started university September 2001. And for those, and I'm kind of outing my age here, but for those of you that are kind of at a similar age range, you know exactly what happened at that time, right? That was, I think, 1 week into school. That's when 9/11 happened, and so I was kind of at this sort of formative point in my life. When you're the prime of your young adulthood, you're just full of energy and you want to do stuff. And I think young Muslims at that point in time, they kind of just didn't have a choice but to become really, active in community, be involved in community activism, being involved in sort of, changing or providing a counter narrative of Muslims. So I think as young Muslims, we were kind of just thrust into that sort of that limelight, whether we want to be or not. And so, throughout those 3 years in my undergrad in commerce, I went through a massive change and evolution, and I ended up finishing the degree. Obviously, my parents would have probably killed me if I didn't. If I spent 3 years and not finish the degree. I finished my degree in accounting, but then at that point in time, I decided, I want to do something which that's meaningful. And it's not to say that that those fields are not meaningful. They are meaningful in different ways. But in terms of who I was and what I was passionate about, I felt I need to pursue something which I can more meaningfully contribute towards. And so I took a path towards education, like Dr. Khalifa. And so I went to a school of education. I was a teacher, a secondary teacher for about 9 years. I taught elementary school as well for 1 year. So I was a teacher for about 10 years. And throughout that time as an educator, I began to realize that the experiences of Muslims in the schools that I was working were dramatically different from what I had experienced as a young Muslim in schools in Canada. And so, I was seeing how Muslims were hiding their Muslim identity. They were denying being Muslim. Young Muslim women were being harassed, having their hijabs pulled off in the schools. And there's a totally different sort of lived experience. And so I wanted to kind of understand that. And so that kind of pushed me towards, I think, studying the experiences of Muslims in schools in Canada. And that's kind of what's led me to this experience or this sort of research in Islamophobia in institutional settings, particularly in schools. And I guess the study of anti-racism in general, looking at anti-racism experiences in schools in general. And as people that are in academia, you kind of have to just snowball your research into different areas in different fields. And so from that, I've looked at this ideas or research in Islamic pedagogy. I'm starting to do work now on this idea of global Islamophobia. So looking at Islamophobia beyond sort of Western context, but across the global North and global South. I'm also very interested in learning about the experiences of refugees. I've done research with the Rohingya, their experiences, being survivors of genocide, and the experiences of people that are, their educational realities of people that are survivors of trauma. So all these things are kind of interconnected, interlinked. And so that's kind of, I think, what's brought me to Yaqeen and doing the work that I'm doing right now.
Alhamdulillah. And we'll get to hear a little bit more about that, but we do have to give you a shout out that it is now 5:30 a.m. Your time. So we really do appreciate you making the time for us to join us today. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, no worries.
Alhamdulillah. Some of the work that you mentioned in terms of, the work that you engage in and write about regarding anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia is something that Noor, you also work in. And in one of your papers on Islamophobia, you talk about, how sort of the machine creates an us versus them mentality. And now you've got sort of this good Muslim versus bad Muslim. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and what's the implication? Why is it that this us versus them, good Muslim, bad Muslim, why does it cause problems, and how does that really affect us on the day-to-day?
Yeah. So this is something that, like you said, I discuss in my paper on Islamophobia, which I think was published last year. But the good Muslim, bad Muslim framework is so it was presented by a professor at Columbia University, Mahmoud Mamdani, and it's basically a way to understand what the interplay is between politics, religion, and culture, and then the implications in terms of policy and identity as well, and different discourses that are happening in communities. And so I'm sure everyone here and probably many of the people who will watch this have heard about the famous clash of civilizations theory, which came out of a discourse by two authors, Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis, in the early to mid 1990s. And basically what the clash of civilizations said is that there's a fundamental kind of inherent civilizational conflict between the West on one hand and Islam or Islamic civilizations on the other hand, and the Islamic civilizations were seen or talked about as sort of an enemy civilization. And an important thing to note is those categories were perceived by these authors as that broad and that all-encompassing and kind of unchanging and ahistorical, and didn't account for all of the nuances that we know exist in both of those categories, whether it be the West, Islam. Of course, we know there's a deep interplay between the two, but that kind of throws all of that to one side and says that these are two opposing civilizations and there's an inherent conflict between them. But one of the things that came out of that type of discourse is that while there is this core unchanging kind of anti-modern characteristic to Islam and Islamic civilizations, there's also a struggle between what Bernard Lewis called or at least started the discussion on, the good Muslims and the bad Muslims, and that within Islamic civilizations, these groups were needed to kind of go through a type of exorcism to root out the bad parts of Islam, if you will, and make sure that the good Muslims kind of prevailed. And so to bring this to kind of out of theory and something really tangible and how we see it play out is that especially post 9/11, we saw that a lot of the rhetoric in whether it was political discourse or policy or even like popular media discourse, TV shows, movies, all of that stuff, really played on this idea of the good Muslim versus the bad Muslim. A lot of people may remember the then President George Bush's speech before the US invasion of Iraq, talking about we need to recognize that not all Muslims are bad. We know there are good Muslims, and these are the Muslims that condemn terror and want to distance themselves from terrorism and the attacks of 9/11. And then there are the bad Muslims who cause the attacks, and those are the ones that we have to go fight. And inherent is the idea that part of the role of the good Muslims is also to support this global war on terror and be a part of that in different ways. And so why I think this is important and why I included it in the paper, and I think it comes up in different ways in many of the different papers that Yaqeen has published, is that in the American Muslim context, it kind of puts Muslims in this position of having to prove that they are good Muslims. And I think it's clear that the implication is that Muslims are bad Muslims until proven innocent. So they're guilty until proven innocent. And so who are the good Muslims? These are the modern Muslims, the secular Muslims, the liberal Muslims, the ones who are patriotic. And then the bad Muslims is kind of everyone else. And so it creates that us versus them mentality. And it also, in terms of creating doubts, it really is at the root, I think, of a lot of the questions that Muslims often we have about our own religion and how we perceive our own religion and understand different concepts in it. And so I think it's important to understand the root of that kind of mentality and where that framework comes from, so that we can even understand how we approach our own faith and also our experience as American Muslims.
That was a very comprehensive summary. Thank you for that. And from really what I understood is that with this is sort of a mentality that oftentimes is really subconscious in our community, that we don't recognize that we're being, we're finding ourselves in this us versus them. And so a lot of times that, we have internalized Islamophobia, effects of internalized Islamophobia, and we don't recognize it. And so bouncing back to you, Dr. Navid, you also work extensively on Islamophobia. And one of the work that, you've published, alhamdulillah, several pieces with us at Yaqeen, but you also have published a book. And in it, you've focused on the experiences of Muslim youth in regard to Islamophobia. So along with, I'm sure, plenty more other effects that we experience, youth and adults alike, why did you think it was important to focus on youth perspective? And what do you think are some other negative effects of Islamophobia on our community?
Yeah, definitely. It was, when I kind of what I was alluding to earlier, when I started teaching in the classroom, I really felt that the experiences of young Muslims was very different than mine. And I think that, we kind of, and this is just it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. You always, as a child or as a young person, you always feel that, the generation above you kind of doesn't understand you, right? It's kind of a bit of a cliche. And, I think that often we have that sort of tendency to authorize our views and just assume that we can understand and we know what people are going through and so on. And so, looking at my experiences as a teacher and seeing what young people were going through, young Muslims were going through, I want to hear from them, their perspectives, and be informed by them, to kind of learn from them. And, in many ways, the experiences are similar, but, obviously they're very much textured by the realities that they're living in. And so they are different as well. And so I think hearing, perspectives from young people, it helps you understand the challenges that they face. And like I said before, I think it's very sort of almost callous to just assume that you understand what people are going through unless you've actually spoken to them and allowed them to kind of express their realities and their sort of experiences. And in doing that, I was able to learn so much. I came across so many experiences of young Muslims, hiding their faith, Muslims experiencing, bullying and being treated in certain ways, which, when I was a child, when I was a student rather, these were things that I never kind of experienced at that same level. And what was interesting to me was seeing how these young people were kind of making sense of their experiences. And it's kind of what you were alluding to before, is that they've really internalized these experiences as almost normal parts or aspects of being a young Muslim in a North American or Western context. They've kind of, in many ways, assumed that this is normal, this is acceptable. And so, some people, they kind of just laugh it off, they don't take it too seriously, and that's probably just a coping mechanism. But many other people, this can be very traumatic. This can be a traumatic experience. And I think, in relation to the mandate or the goals that Yaqeen tries to promote is, you want to dispel doubt and you want to, I guess, have a stronger, firmer sort of identity as a Muslim. I think that, when you kind of normalize this behavior and you kind of see it as what's expected as if you're a Muslim, growing up in these times, the risk or the dangers that you completely disassociate yourself from that identity and you leave it all together. And so when I hear, sort of studies from ISPU or different think tanks or different organizations of Muslims either leaving the faith or hiding their faith, it's not surprising to me. When you talk to young people, their experiences very much reaffirm that, that's a eventuality that will happen if we're not kind of willing to sort of challenge those experiences or those sort of those institutional practices which target or discriminate against young people. So I think it's essential to hear from young people. You get a sense of what their realities are, and in doing so, you can work towards positive change. And ultimately, in addition to being an academic, I'm a parent. And I do want to essentially work towards a society that's where my children can grow up and not feel fear about their faith or not feel ashamed about their faith or their identity. And so it's sort of I think it's an essential aspect of the work that you're doing. If you're learning about Islamophobia, it's to hear from the people that are the most exposed to it, and that often happens in institutional settings like schools.
That's awesome, because you're addressing this problem straight on, and then working really towards that end goal, the solution. And I think that's what's wonderful about this department, is that the goal is to address these contemporary problems, these issues, and engage in these discussions, all with that end goal of having a solution. And that's what's, I think, so incredibly transformative, really, about the work that you guys all do with Yaqeen and outside of that. Dr. Muhammad Khalifa, really directly connecting to that line of thought, you wrote one of my favorite pieces at Yaqeen in regard to ancestral knowledge, and in it you talk about some of the Islamic ethics that really are necessary or should be considered when we're talking about really responding to and providing solutions for oppressive systems, oppressive structures like that, the structural racism. And you were also particularly in Minnesota when with the murder of George Floyd and when the protests erupted afterwards. So I'm really curious to know what your experience as an academic, as a Muslim, as a scholar, all of these different identities that you have and experiences that you can share with us, how you think that our community, or as a Muslim, what our ethics, our principles, how they call us to addressing and solving these issues.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Thank you for your question. I think that, first of all, there's something that there's a reason that Allah allowed certain things to happen to the Prophet, who was the most beloved to Allah, the slander of his wife, losing certain battles, poverty, and other things like that. And the blessing often comes from the struggle. I know that sounds bad for people who are going through trauma, but for example, the structural racism that happened to my community, the African American community, birthed a number of liberation movements that I don't know many Black people that don't not only associate with it, but take great pride and great investment in the identities associated with that, such as the Nation of Islam for my family, but not just that, the Black Panthers. In fact, one of the papers that I was just communicating with Dr. Omar Suleiman recently that I hope to write with James Wright is on the Black radical tradition. And so if young Muslims and young people of color see oppression and racism as intractable and as immutable and as fixed, as static, then of course people will lose hope. But one of the things that have motivated people to build hundreds, thousands, in fact, of Black-owned cities across the country, in Detroit and we've been hearing about Tulsa, but those weren't the only two cities. Detroit, over 1,027 to some estimate, cities were destroyed only for people to continue to try to push forward and to rebuild and such. And so I just wanted to say up front that I believe that, there's a lot that African Americans, because see, when Noor and Navid were speaking about the experiences of young Muslims, I'm thinking, well, African Americans don't really have those kind of complexities in similar ways. We have other things that we're dealing with, but I don't know many African Americans that don't feel like they can show up and be authentically Muslim and authentically Black, and that they would have people in their communities that would not accept their place there. But as for the question more pointedly, as you asked, and you're right, I was there not just with George Floyd, but I was also freshly there when Philando Castile was murdered, which was a mile from my home. And we've been dealing with that. I do think that there are things that the Muslim community need to be aware of. And I don't think that we are addressing that properly as a community in general. I think that Yaqeen has a unique opportunity to do so. But Muslims usually show up in most communities in which I've lived, talking about Islamophobia, but not talking about anti-racism, talking about, the oppression of Muslim, and not talking about things that impact, Latinos or indigenous people. They are not connected with those community organizing folks in communities. So they miss out on a number of things. Number one, they miss out on solidarities, the possibility of solidarities that people can show up for them because that solidarity, that trust is there. But number two, they miss out on these traditions. Like there is knowledge, there's ancestral knowledge that lives and that's intergenerational, that's embodied knowledge that are in all of these communities that are surrounding Muslims. And they're not unearthing or recognize, they can't even recognize what they are. They go into spaces and it's invisible to Muslims. They're not able to see how this group of people, of that group of people have gone through something similar 50 years or 100 years ago, and they recovered and they refocused. And they did dig into this society in particular ways. They gave them access to some things that Muslims themselves don't have. And so I think that it's a great question. And I think that our work lies ahead of us. I don't know many people that are doing it. And those who are doing it haven't been embraced really by most Muslim communities around. And so I'll stop there. We can get more deeply into some of the weeds if there's time later.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the work is just getting started and there's so much that needs to be done. So Dr. Zara, if you could go ahead and sort of recap what, based off everyone has really contributed to this discussion. You're now that, you're the director of the department, you have incredible, really talented fellows working on your team. What do you think, what do you really hope the impact of this department will look like based off of, some of these suggestions Dr. Khalifa offered, as well as the other panelists? Long term, like people are coming through, they're reading our content, they're seeing the work that you guys are producing. What's the world going to look like? What is that individual going to look like after being aware of these issues and offered those solutions?
Yeah, no. Mashallah, Jazakallah khair for your question. And really, I'm the one that benefits from working with all of the fellows who have spoken, as well as those who are not able to join us today. I'm the one that learns from all of my colleagues here in the department, more so than the other way around. So I'm really privileged to work with such a great group, mashallah. I think that the hope and the end goal, really, our job in this department is an educational job. We are not an advocacy organization, but our work can help advocates. We are not a masjid, we are not a imam center, but our work can help faith leaders. So we provide educational material, well-researched, coming from different areas of knowledge and subject matter expertise, well-sourced, well-argued, making compelling arguments to help the broader American Muslim audience learn the facts of various political, social, economic situations that the whole country as a whole, the society as a whole, as well as then communities, different faith communities and specific to American Muslim communities deal with. And our work can really help to build some of the bridges that have been highlighted and mentioned. So I'll just give some examples from my own knowledge, from my own experience. We have, for example, something like the war of terror. A lot of Muslims can kind of easily get on board and have a critical posture towards something like the war on terror because of, let's say, experiences communally as well as individually. But we have something like the war on drugs. And one thing I teach my students is the war on drugs and the war on terror are very much parallel institutions in this society. Before the war on terror was launched, we had about 40 years of practice in this country using the war of drugs. Before the USA Patriot Act was passed, there was Clinton's crime bill and there was Reaganomics, right? And so there were these precedents and there are these overlapping structures, and the experiences of people under structural oppression are very much overlapping as well. And so as Dr. Khalifa was just mentioning, and as my sister Noor mentioned, her trip and her visit to Palestine and how that was able to bring about a living history and inform ongoing political history, in the making, a living tradition. In the same way, we can talk about, as this is fresh in everybody's hearts and minds at the moment, we can talk about how, illegal Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza can be very much understood in a way to help us better understand some of the occupation that occurs by law enforcement in certain communities in this country. right? And there are very, very concrete parallels that we can draw. We don't have to stay in the abstract with that. And again, this is not the time to get into that. Maybe that can be a next paper coming soon from the department. But it's very important. I think the work we do is really to provide the broader audience with well-sourced, grounded in knowledge, grounded in facts, grounded in sound political theories, whether those theories are coming from Muslim or non-Muslim sources, to draw on the shared heritage of knowledge. And remember that knowledge is the purvey of the believer wherever she finds it. And to kind of do that work, because Allah has blessed us with the passion as well as the skills and the formal education to do that work, and to provide that to our audience. And then we've got our amazing creative and marketing teams who take that and turn it into formats that people can easily take and learn from, inshallah. And so I think that that's really our goal, is to do that educational work, to be motivated by our principles, to be motivated by our love for Allah, our love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and really, I think at the bottom, if I may say so, help to make a small contribution in indigenizing Islamic knowledge in America. Indigenizing meaning that it has to be growing from the roots of the American soil. And while we draw on various traditions from within Islamic civilizational past, because that is also part of our shared heritage, nonetheless, we are our knowledge is rooted here and therefore is sharing in the epistemes of other communities, and we are growing from the ground up there and fully relevant. The fruit of our knowledge has to be relevant, palatable, and digestible to the people of this land. And so therefore, that I think would be maybe one of the greatest contributions that we can hope to make through this educational work, inshallah.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept. Thank you for Jazakallah khairan, really, for providing that insight into what the department does. And I think to sum up, it's really addressing these very relevant and sometimes destructive systems of power, or structures of power that we have in our society, and also just addressing contemporary topics, political topics that we are confronted with in our societies today. And it's one part of it is to engage and discuss, but a lot of it, as you heard today, is about offering a solution and starting to think about what happens next. And I think that's something that's incredible about this department, because when you are now talking about these problems and then looking at solutions that are rooted in Islamic ethics, Islamic principles, you are, rather than walking away feeling drained as we do reading or facing these problems in the news or in real life, you walk away empowered. And I think that's what's incredible about about the work that you do. I'm feeling more confident knowing that Islam has a solution to this. I'm feeling more, motivated and passionate about change because I have that solution in mind now. And so the education, the work that you all are doing it's beyond really education. It's about creating that desire, that confidence to be able to contribute to society. And I think that that's what's really, really incredible about everything that you guys all do. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all of your work and put really blessing in everything that you all do, so we can continue to see that change. And who knows, you might not realize the amount of difference that you're making in the lives of young individuals, older individuals, and that we can only pray that on the Day of Judgment, inshallah, you'll be able to witness the impact that you all had. Really the big change that just a paper, just a video can really spiral into. So barakallahu feekum. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept it from you all. And jazakumullah khairan once again for joining us from 5:30 in the morning to 10 p.m. at night, wherever we all were. Alhamdulillah, it was a pleasure speaking to you all. We'll go ahead and conclude with that. So jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Jazakallah khairan.
Ameen.